Hello and welcome back. I know it has been quite a long time. I've really struggled with where to go from here, and just recently I've had several topics just hit my brain and I've been piecing some things together. So here we go. I want to talk this week about being broken. Are we born broken or do we become broken? So have you ever met someone and thought they've just always been that way? Maybe they're naturally optimistic, maybe they're overly anxious, maybe they're quick to anger, maybe they're deeply compassionate or quiet or impulsive. We tend to assume personality is fixed. We say things like, oh, that's just who I am, or I've always been this way. And then there's the people whose lives seem to split into nearly two chapters. The ones that say before the accident, or that was before the abuse, or before the betrayal, before the diagnosis, before the war, before the loss. And then there's after. The same person, yet somehow not the same person. Trauma has a way of doing that. It changes the way that we think, the way we feel, the way we trust. Sometimes it even changes the way our brains function, and that's crazy to me. So what are we supposed to make of that? Was that person always carrying the seeds of who they would become? Or did suffering fundamentally change them? So today we're asking a question that sits at the intersection of psychology, philosophy, neuroscience, and theology. Are we born broken, or do we become broken? It's one of the questions that sounds simple until you actually start thinking about it. Because depending on how you answer it, you change the way you think about mental illness, about trauma, about addiction, personality, parenting, responsibility, even about God himself. So let's think about this together. If you have ever taken an introductory psychology course, you've probably heard of the debate between nature and nurture, or nature versus nurture. And the question it really asks is, are we shaped primarily by our biology, or are we shaped primarily by our experiences? For over a century, psychologists have argued over this question. Francis Galton believed heredity explained much, if not all, of human behavior. Then behaviorists like B.F. Skinner emphasized the power of environment and conditioning. Developmental psychologists highlighted early attachment and relationships. But neuroscientists began showing us that experience literally changes the brain. So today, most psychologists would tell you it's not either or, it's both. Genes matter, environments matter, relationships matter, culture matters, stress matters, nutrition matters, sleep matters. Virtually everything influences who we become. But psychology isn't the only field asking this question. The Bible has been asking a version of it for thousands of years. Why do humans do things they don't want to do? Why do people sometimes become cruel? Why do children suffer? Why are we capable of breathtaking love and unspeakable evil? Those are psychological questions. They're also theological ones. And I think one of the greatest mistakes we can make is assuming psychology and theology are trying to answer the same exact question. Most often, they're not. Psychology is usually asking, how does this happen? While theology is usually asking, why does this happen? Those are different questions, and we need answers to both. So let's work on answering this question. Are we born this way? We'll start with where modern science starts, the day we're born. Actually, let's go back even further. Long before you were born, your story had already begun. Your DNA is formed, your brain begins developing in the womb, your nervous system starts wiring itself together. Researchers have found that infants arrive in the world with remarkably different temperaments. Some are calm, some are highly reactive, some adapt quickly to change, others become distressed by even small disruptions. Parents with multiple children will even notice this immediately. I have twins, and even though they were born at the same time, they have very different personalities. Children who are raised in the same household by the same parents with the same rules, yet completely different. One child walks into kindergarten excited, another clings to their parents' legs in tears. One sleeps through the night, another one doesn't. One seeks adventure, another prefers predictability. Why? Because psychologists, they call this temperamental differences, and they are among the earliest signs that biology matters. Then we look at genetics. Twin studies have consistently shown that many psychological traits have a hereditary component. Not just eye color or height, but things like anxiety, depression, ADHD, bipolar disorder. Personality traits like extroversion and conscientiousness. Even resilience appears to have some biological influence. Now, that doesn't mean that there's an anxiety gene or a depression gene, and if your mom had it, then you're going to have it too. That's not what it's implying. Human behavior is far too complex for that. Instead, researchers are talking about genetic vulnerability. So think of it like this. Imagine two people standing outside during a thunderstorm. One has an umbrella, one doesn't. Neither person caused the rain, but they're likely to experience it differently. Our biology can function in a very similar way. Some people are born with nervous systems that are more sensitive to stress. Some recover from adversity more quickly. Some are naturally more cautious. Some are naturally more impulsive. That isn't a moral judgment. It's simply part of human variation. But here's where psychology becomes especially interesting. Having a vulnerability is not the same thing as having a destiny. A child may inherit a predisposition towards anxiety, but yet never develop an anxiety disorder. Another child may have no obvious biological risk factor and still struggle profoundly later in life. Why? Because it's not just about biology. Biology is never acting alone. There are always going to be other components. But let's look at the other side of the equation. Imagine two newborn babies. Neither one has language. Neither one understands the world. Neither one has formed beliefs about themselves. Everything they learn about safety, about love, about trust will come through relationships. This supports the idea that we become who and what we experience. Long before a child can even say the words, "I'm not good enough," they may begin to feel it. Long before they can explain abandonment, their nervous system can learn to expect it. This is where attachment theory becomes so compelling. Developed by John Bowlby and later expanded by Mary Ainsworth, attachment theory suggests that our earliest relationships become a template for future relationships. If caregivers are consistently available, children often develop a secure sense of the world. However, if caregivers are unpredictable, frightening, emotionally unavailable, or neglectful, children adapt to that, and adaptation is the key word. Children don't choose their coping mechanisms, they develop them. The child who learns to become invisible may not be shy by nature. They may have discovered that being unnoticed kept them safe. The child who becomes a perfectionist may not simply love excellence, they may have learned that mistakes brought criticism. The child who constantly seeks reassurance may not be needy by nature. They may have grown up never knowing when love would disappear. Psychology calls these adaptations. Theology might call them the effects of living in a fallen world. Either way, they remind us of something important. People rarely become who they are overnight. They become who they are one experience at a time. So now that we've talked about that and kind of dived a little bit into that nature versus nurture argument, at this point it might sound like we've arrived at the answer. Some of us inherit vulnerabilities. Some of us are shaped by experience. Case closed. Except Christianity has always told a much bigger story. The Bible doesn't begin with brokenness. It begins with God's goodness. Genesis opens with a world untouched by shame, untouched by death, untouched by trauma. And over again, after each act of creation, God steps back and declares that it is good. Then, after creating humanity in his own image, he says something remarkable. He said, "It is very good." So think about that for just a moment. Before there was anxiety, before there was abuse, before there was betrayal, before there was a panic attacks, before there was eating disorders, addiction, depression, there was goodness. Not perfection in the sense that humanity couldn't grow or mature, but perfection in relationship. Relationship with God, relationship with one another, with creation, within ourselves. Everything was ordered. Everything was integrated. There was no hiding. There was no shame. There was no fear. There was no fractured identity. In psychology, we often talk about integration. A healthy person is someone whose thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and values work together rather than constantly fighting each other. Genesis paints a picture of humanity that is profoundly integrated. Adam and Eve aren't pretending. They're not performing. They're not ashamed of themselves. They're just there. They're present. It's difficult to imagine because none of us have ever experienced that kind of existence. Every one of us has been born into a world where brokenness has become normal. We've never known anything else. But everything changed. Genesis 3 isn't just the story of the first sin, it's the story of the first fracture. Notice what happens almost immediately. Adam and Eve hid. Before this moment, they walked with God openly. Now they're hiding. Why? Shame. Then they blame each other, so their relationship breaks. Then the ground is cursed. Creation breaks. Then death enters the picture. Bodies break. Everything begins unraveling. Sometimes we imagine the fall as simply introducing moral evil into the world, but Scripture paints a bigger picture. The entire created order was disrupted. The Apostle Paul writes in Romans that creation itself is groaning. Not just people, creation. It's waiting, longing, straining for restoration. The language is fascinating because groaning is exactly how many people describe emotional suffering. I don't even have the words. I just feel heavy. I feel like something is wrong. The Bible says you're not imagining it. Something is wrong, not only with you, with everything, with creation and humanity as a whole. So here's where Christians have often disagreed. Some traditions emphasize what theologians call original sin. Others focus more heavily on original goodness or the image of God. Depending on your church background, you've probably heard one emphasize more than the other. Some Christians grow up hearing, you're a sinner. Others grew up hearing, you're a child of God. Now, don't get me wrong, both of those are biblical, but neither one tells the whole story by itself. If all you hear is that you're sinful, born in sin, shaped in iniquity, you may begin to believe that there's nothing beautiful about being human. But if all you hear is that you're made in God's image, you might struggle to explain why evil feels so natural. Scripture refuses to let us choose one. It insists on both. We bear God's image, and we also bear the consequences of the fall. We are capable of extraordinary compassion, but we are also capable of astonishing cruelty. We write symphonies, we build hospitals, we sacrifice ourselves for strangers, but we also wage war. We exploit one another. We betray others. We tell lies. Humanity abuses children. How can both be true? Because humanity is glorious, but it's fractured. I think this distinction matters tremendously, especially when we talk about mental health. Sometimes Christians use the word broken when they actually mean sinful. Those aren't always the same thing. A woman who develops postpartum depression isn't choosing rebellion against God. A veteran experiencing PTSD isn't living in unrepented sin. A child with autism isn't spiritually defective. A man battling obsessive compulsive disorder isn't necessarily lacking faith. Brokenness can be the result of living in a world that no longer functions the way God intended it to function. Cancer is brokenness. Alzheimer's brokenness. Earthquakes are brokenness. So are panic disorders or traumatic memories. This does not mean every psychological struggle is morally neutral. Our responses still matter. Our choices still matter, but suffering and sin are not interchangeable. The Bible makes that distinction repeatedly. One of the clearest examples is in John chapter 9. Jesus encounters a man who was blind since birth. The disciples immediately ask the question, who sinned? Him? Was it his parents? They automatically make that assumption that something is wrong. Someone did something wrong. And Jesus completely refuses that idea. He says neither. Neither. The answer should reshape how Christians think about human suffering. Sometimes pain isn't punishment. Sometimes suffering isn't evidence of personal failure. Sometimes brokenness is simply brokenness. We all inherited a world we didn't choose. So here's something I find deeply humbling. None of us chose the family we were born into. We didn't choose our genetics. We don't choose our childhood. We don't choose whether our parents are emotionally healthy or emotionally unavailable. We didn't choose whether we grew up in safety or chaos. We didn't choose our temperament. We don't choose the century we were born in, because I can promise it wouldn't have been this one. We don't choose the country we're born into. We don't choose our socioeconomic status. Our story, it starts way before we're capable of making any decisions that are going to impact our long-term life. That's true psychologically, it's true theologically. Every one of us inherits a world we didn't create, a family we didn't choose, a body we did not design, a creation already marked by the consequences of the fall. That realization should produce two things, humility and compassion. Because if I had lived your life with your parents, with your nervous system, your experiences, your losses, would I really be all that different? Psychologically, this encourages us to ask that question. I think Jesus would too. One of the reasons I love studying both psychology and theology is because neither one asks us to ignore reality. Good psychology says, tell me your story. Good theology says, tell me the whole story. Those are different invitations. Psychology wants to understand how you became who you are, while theology wants to understand who you were created to be. Those aren't competing questions, they're complementary, but there are places where they do begin to diverge. So let's start with where they agree. They both agree that people can be wounded. This probably seems obvious to most people. Of course people can be wounded. That's a stupid statement. But just pause for a moment and consider how revolutionary that idea actually is. Both psychology and Christianity reject the idea that human beings exist in isolation. We are shaped by relationships. Psychologists call it attachment. The Bible calls it discipleship, fellowship, family, community. From the very beginning of Genesis, God says something startling. He says, it is not good for man to be alone. Notice that loneliness isn't introduced after the fall. Relationship was always part of God's design. Why? Because we are relational beings. Our identities are formed in relationship. Our wounds often happen in a relationship. And perhaps much of our healing also happens in relationship. Psychologists know this. Therapists know this. The church should know this too. They both agree that thoughts matter. One of the cornerstones of modern psychology is the idea that our thoughts influence our emotions and thus our behavior. If you've ever heard of cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT, you've encountered this idea. CBT isn't based on the belief that changing your thoughts magically solves every problem. It's based on the observation that the stories we tell ourselves shape the way we experience reality. Imagine someone who believes, I'm a failure. Every mistake becomes evidence for their thoughts. Every criticism confirms it. Every success will get dismissed as just luck. And the belief becomes a filter through which every experience is interpreted. Now listen to the Apostle Paul when he says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Not your circumstances, not your income, not the renewing of your popularity, your mind. Or consider Proverbs, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. The Bible has always taken the life of the mind seriously. Not because thoughts create reality, but because thoughts shape how we respond to reality. And that's an important distinction. Christianity isn't just positive thinking or being extra optimistic. It isn't manifestation. It's not pretending everything is okay. It's learning to align our minds with what is true, even when our emotions lag behind. Now, that's how theology and psychology are similar in these concepts, but there are some ways where they begin to part. Here's where things become more interesting. Psychology is incredibly good at describing. It can often explain how something developed. It can map trauma. It can identify unhealthy attachment patterns. It can show us how memories are stored. It can help us understand why panic attacks happen, why compulsions develop, why avoidance feels safer than vulnerability. Those are all very remarkable contributions, but psychology usually stops at the explanation. It asks, how did you get here? Christianity asks another question, what were you created for? Those are not the same question. Imagine someone standing in front of the Grand Canyon. Psychology might explain the geology, right? Millions of years of erosion, rock layers, river systems, pressure, time, and all of that is extremely fascinating. But theology asks something different. Why does beauty move us? Why do we feel awe? Why does something inside us long for transcendence? Explanation and meaning are not the same thing. Likewise, psychology can explain why you struggle with shame. Christianity asks whether shame was ever a part of God's original design. Psychology can explain why forgiveness is emotionally beneficial. Christianity asks why forgiveness is spiritually necessary. Psychology can describe attachment. Christianity introduces us to a God who calls himself Father. One offers mechanisms, the other offers meaning, and I think we need both. There is a danger of explaining everything, though. Once we understand why we do something, we can begin to excuse it. This is something I see more and more in our culture, and even more and more in therapist's office. Someone says, I have anxiety. Another says, I have trauma. Someone else says, my parents were emotionally unavailable. All of those things may be and are probably completely true, but explanation is not exemption. Understanding your story doesn't remove your responsibility. It changes how we approach it. If someone breaks their legs, we don't blame them for limping, but we also don't tell them to keep walking on a broken leg forever. Compassion doesn't eliminate responsibility. It makes responsibility possible. The same is true psychologically. The same is true spiritually. Your past explains you, but you should not let it imprison you. A mistake that the church sometimes make is confusing understanding with compromise. Sometimes Christians are afraid that if we acknowledge the role of trauma or genetics or brain chemistry, we'll somehow diminish the reality of sin. And I don't think that's true. Jesus never seemed threatened by complexity. He could acknowledge someone's suffering without denying their responsibility. He could extend compassion without abandoning truth and reality. Think about the woman caught in adultery. He protected her from condemnation, but he also told her, not in these words, but leave here and knock it off and quit doing that. Grace and truth, this is what it is. It's compassion, but still accountability, mercy, and transformation. Yes, you can acknowledge that we are humanity and we have human nature, but we still have to say, I'm going to choose to do better. I'm going to choose to be different. A mistake psychology sometimes makes is that it has its own blind spots. Sometimes it becomes so focused on healing the self that it never asks whether the self should be transformed. Modern culture often tells us the highest goal is self-expression. Christianity says the highest goal is to be Christ-like. And I think that's where the mistake comes between psychology and Christianity or theology or beliefs, is that psychology tends to have a concept of be your best self, do what makes you happy. And in reality, Christianity backs the belief that if you are doing what makes you Christ-like and what makes God happy, then you're on the right path. Modern culture uses it like this, and those are very different versions of human flourishing, of improving on oneself. So one might ask, how can I become more fully myself? When in reality, as a Christian, we should be asking, how can I become more like Christ? Now, those aren't always conflicting. In fact, I think becoming more like Christ often leads us to becoming the person that he created us to be. But they're not identical. Psychology tends to ask, what do you want? But the gospel asks, what were you made for? Those questions can lead us in very different directions, and we have to be mindful of which one we're asking ourselves as we're working on ourselves and trying to be better today than we were yesterday. Are we asking ourselves, what would make you happy? What would make you feel better? Or are we saying, what does God want me to do? What were you made to do? What were you created for? There are some tensions that we live in that comes with that, though. And here's where I kind of want to land and wrap things up. I don't think we should fear psychology. I don't think we should worship it either, though. Psychology is a wonderful tool, but it is a terrible savior. It can help us understand. It can give us language. It can provide us tools. It can illuminate patterns, but it cannot tell us why we exist. It cannot define goodness. It cannot offer ultimate hope. Only God can do that. At the same time, I don't think Christians should ignore the incredible insights that psychology has given us about trauma, relationships, about development and healing. Truth is God's truth. wherever we find it. The question is not, should Christians listen to psychology? The better question is, how do we discern what is true, reject what is false, and integrate what is good? Because that's what Christians have always done. So we've covered quite a bit so far, but I want to touch on a few more things here before we close. The question I want to really ask here is, if I didn't choose my brokenness, what am I responsible for? I think this is the question hiding underneath everything we've talked about. Because if I inherited my temperament, if my brain developed in response to trauma, if my childhood shaped the way I relate to other people, if I didn't choose the family I was born into, then what am I actually responsible for? And it's a fair question. It's one I think both psychologically and theologically can be answered in remarkably similar ways. Neither one says you're responsible for what happened to you, but both would argue that eventually you become responsible for what you do with what happened to you. And that's an uncomfortable truth, because there are really only two extremes. One says everything is your fault, the other says nothing is your fault, and neither of those observations are true. If someone abused me or abused you, that wasn't mine or your fault. If you're neglected, that's not your fault. If you grew up walking on eggshells because your home never felt safe, that obviously wasn't your fault. If your nervous system learned to stay in survival mode because survival was necessary, that wasn't your fault. But here's the hard part, and I think the hardest part for people to accept in our modern society, is that it is now your responsibility to decide whether those wounds will continue directing your life. Notice I didn't say it's your responsibility to heal overnight. Healing isn't a switch. It's not something you decide on a Tuesday and finish by Friday. Healing is usually very slow and very messy and very painful and aggravating. But healing begins the moment we stop asking, whose fault is this? And start asking, what now? Now, the difference between fault and responsibility, one of the most helpful ideas I've ever encountered is this distinction. Fault and responsibility are not the same thing. Suppose someone crashes into your parked car. You weren't even inside. Clearly, the accident was not your fault. But eventually, the insurance company calls, the repair shop calls, you have to arrange transportation, you have decisions to make. None of that is fair. You didn't cause the damage, but the damage is now yours to deal with. Our emotional lives often work the same way. Many of us are carrying wounds we didn't create, yet those wounds are still going to affect our relationships, our marriages, our partners, our parenting, our friendships, our churches, our work, our relationship with God even. And at some point, every one of us has to face the same question. Will I let my wounds become my identity, or will I allow them to become part of my story? Those are two very different things. And the difference between identity and history, I think, is one of the greatest temptations today, is to confuse the two. Psychology has given us wonderful language. We talk about trauma, attachment styles, anxiety disorders, etc. And these diagnoses are incredibly helpful. I'm currently in a diagnosis course right now, and they help us. They help us understand what we're experiencing or what other people are experiencing. They connect people to treatments. They reduce shame. And those are all good things. Those are wonderful things. But as with everything, every good thing can and will at times be misused. Sometimes we stop saying I have anxiety and we begin saying I am an anxious person. Instead of saying I have something or I'm struggling with something, we start to make it our whole personality and our whole identity. We stop saying I experienced trauma and we start saying I'm traumatized. And do you hear the difference? One describes an experience, the other describes an identity. These words matter. Identity matters even more, because whatever we build our identity on eventually becomes the lens through which we see ourselves. If my deepest identity is my diagnosis, then every part of my life begins orbiting around it. I think we all know somebody, especially because late adulthood diagnosis has really become a thing. And I don't downplay diagnoses that people receive later in life, but I have seen people who get a diagnosis, whether it's OCD, ADHD, autism, and they get these as adults, and I appreciate that they can finally start understanding some things that they struggled with before. But I do tend to worry when they start making it their whole world, their whole life, their whole personality. And every part of their life begins orbiting around it. So if your deepest identity is your diagnosis, if your deepest identity is your past, Christianity offers something radically different. It doesn't deny that we have a history. It just refuses to let our history have the final word. So Scripture never pretends the past didn't happen. One of the things I love about the Bible is that it didn't sanitize people's stories. David is still an adulterer and a murderer. Peter still denied Jesus. Paul still persecuted Christians. Moses still killed an Egyptian. Rahab was still a prostitute. The Samaritan woman still had 5 husbands. The Bible doesn't erase people's past. It redeems them, and that's very different. Sometimes I think we imagine redemption means pretending the pain never happened, and it doesn't. Redemption means God weaving even the darkest threads into a story that ultimately points to His grace. Joseph never forgot that his brother sold him to slavery. He remembered. Nobody would forget something like that. It was very clear to him. But by the end of Genesis, he could say something crazy. He said, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." What he didn't say is, it wasn't that bad. He didn't say, everything happens for a reason. He doesn't excuse what happens. He names it for what it is. It's evil, and it was. And yet, he also still believes that evil doesn't get the last word. That's redemption. This brings me to something else. Can we ever go back? And I've wrestled with this personally, and maybe you have too. Sometimes after trauma, people ask, will I ever be the person I used to be? And it's such a human question. Maybe after divorce or losing a child or surviving abuse, receiving a diagnosis or walking through years of depression, there's often a longing to go back, to become who we were before. But what if healing isn't about going back? What if healing is about going forward? Think about physical wounds. When you break a bone and it heals, the bone doesn't return to its exact previous state. It remodels, it changes. Sometimes it even becomes stronger at the site of healing. There's still evidence that the injury occurred, but there's also evidence that healing happened. I wonder if our souls are more like that than we realize. Maybe the goal isn't to erase what happened. Maybe the goal is to become someone who is no longer defined by it. Not because the pain disappeared, but because God met us in it. There is hope hidden in responsibility. I know responsibility can sound heavy, but I actually think it's hopeful because responsibility means agency. It means your past influences you, but it doesn't own you. It means your childhood shaped you, but it doesn't write every chapter of your future. It means your biology matters, but it isn't your destiny. If all we had were biology, there would be very little hope. If all we had were trauma, there would be no hope. If all we had was our own willpower, there would be no hope. But the Christian story says something different. God doesn't merely forgive sinners, He transforms people. And if that's true, then no matter how your story began, it doesn't have to end there. So I hope this helped you in some way. I hope you walk away from this and go, I am not, just because I live in a broken world does not mean I am permanently broken. And if you know somebody that needs to hear this, send it to them, tag them in it, all of the things. Reach out to me. I love to hear from people, what they thought, what they're thinking, if it's helped them, if it's made them worse. I want to hear it all. So with that in mind, take care of your mind, take care of your soul, and take care of yourself.